Okay, get this. Life-sized sex doll, purchased with life insurance money. That's just one piece of the puzzle we're looking at today.
Sounds ominous already.
It is. It's the Kristen Trickle case. Did her husband Colby stage a suicide, or was it really a tragic end?
So we're diving into some trial transcripts, evidence reports, the whole 9 yards to try to figure this one out.
Exactly. And you know what's extra interesting about this one?
Lay it on me.
The prosecution actually used a psychological autopsy.
Oh, wow. That's not something you see every day, so we'll have to break down how that works and all that, right?
Absolutely. But first, let's set the scene.
Okay, take me there.
Halloween morning, 2019. Sergeant Brandon Hallman walks into the Trickle house, finds Kristen in bed, still alive but barely, gunshot wound under the chin, a massive .357 revolver right there. Just from that scene, what are investigators thinking?
Red flags all over the place. I mean, a .357, that's a powerful handgun, not typically what a woman would choose. And we found out later her family said she was terrified of guns.
So that right there is already a little suspicious.
Yeah, and then the placement of the gun. It just doesn't fit with his self-inflicted wound. Plus, get this. Kristen had set an alarm for work and had Halloween candy out, like she was expecting trick-or-treaters. Does that sound like someone about to end it all?
Not really, no. You think those little everyday things would slip your mind if you were planning something like that.
Right. But then we have Colby's 911 call. Obviously, he's distraught, but there are some things he says to the police that raise eyebrows. Like, he claims that after finding Kristen, he considered suicide. He even put the gun back on her stomach.
Okay, so I see how that would be a little strange, but why are those little inconsistencies such a big deal?
Well, think of it like this. They're cracks in a carefully constructed story.
I like that. So those tiny slips can actually trip someone up.
Absolutely. And Colby's got a few of them.
Like what?
He initially said Kristen kept the .357 by her side of the bed. But the crime scene photos? And even Colby's own cell phone pictures, they all show the firearms on his side of the bed.
So he's contradicting himself with his own evidence. Rookie mistake.
You got it. And then there's the life insurance policy.
Yeah, that's right. Colby said he didn't know anything about it.
But guess what?
What?
Investigators found evidence that he'd Googled the payout amount.
Oh, come on. That's so obvious.
Right. And there's more. He claimed no idea that Kristen was afraid of guns. Her family said that was totally false. And of course, there's the online relationship with another woman, which he tried to downplay.
It's like every time he talks, he digs himself a deeper hole.
Exactly. And the web of lies gets even more tangled when you look at his supposed military service.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that in the files. He claimed he was deployed to Central America, even worked in human intelligence, right?
Yeah, impressive, right? Except the military confirmed he was never deployed overseas, and he had zero experience in human intelligence.
So now we've got a suspicious death, a husband with a story full of holes.
And possible motives popping up everywhere.
Which brings us back to the psychological autopsy, right?
Right. So how do you do that? I mean, Kristen can't tell us her side of the story anymore.
That's a good question. How do you perform a psychological autopsy on someone who's gone?
It's like piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah.
You use memories, impressions from the people who knew her best. Dr. Ashley Christensen, she's a forensic psychologist. She interviewed Kristen's family, her friends, looked at social media, tried to build a picture of what her state of mind was like before her death.
So she's trying to answer the question, was Kristen the type of person to take her own life?
Exactly.
What did she conclude?
That Kristen was actually at low risk for suicide.
Which goes totally against Colby's claim that she was upset about his online thing.
Right. So the prosecution, they've got a pretty strong piece of evidence challenging that initial ruling of suicide. But is a psychological autopsy really rock solid? Couldn't those memories be, influenced by grief? Maybe even wanting to see Colby convicted.
It's a great point. And it's definitely one of the things that makes this type of evidence controversial. Yeah, I remember hearing about psychological autopsies being challenged in court before.
It happens. The big criticism is it relies on what other people remember, which, of course, that's subjective. Plus, in this case, Dr. Christensen was doing her interviews 2 years after Kristen died. Memories fade. Right?
Yeah, they get mixed up. Makes it hard to be totally sure they're accurate.
For sure.
Okay, so we have these different stories, digital breadcrumbs that point to deception, and this psychological profile. How did all this play out when the case went to trial?
Well, the prosecution, they had a pretty clear strategy. Hit hard on those inconsistencies in Colby's story. the different versions of what happened with the gun, his knowledge of the life insurance, the whole downplayed affair thing.
Right, and the psychological autopsy, saying Kristen wasn't suicidal.
Absolutely. They presented Dr. Christensen's findings, arguing that Kristen had plans for the future.
Makes sense. So what about the defense? How'd they try to counter all that?
Well, Colby's lawyers argued that Kristen had been dealing with depression since she was a kid. They said the prosecution was ignoring her mental health history. They also tried to minimize that whole online relationship thing, calling it a harmless flirtation. And they tried to explain away all of Colby's inconsistent statements as, him just being in shock and grieving.
So, classic courtroom battle. The grieving husband versus the suspicious family.
Exactly.
Were there any moments in the trial that really stick out?
One that comes to mind is when the prosecution brought in a gun similar to the .357. They actually demonstrated how the sight imprint on Kristen's chin didn't line up with a self-inflicted wound.
Hold on, a sight imprint.
Yeah, when a gun's fired at close range, that front sight, it can leave a small mark on the skin. So the location of that mark in this case, well, it suggested that someone else was holding the gun.
Wow. I can see why that'd make the jury think twice. So what was the verdict?
Well, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, they came back with a guilty verdict. First-degree premeditated murder.
Wow, they didn't take long to decide. Sounds like they bought the prosecution's case. What happened after that?
Well, remember that coroner who initially ruled Kristen's death a suicide?
Yeah.
So after the trial, he admitted he hadn't been given all the information during his initial investigation. He hadn't talked to Kristen's family, didn't see the weapon, didn't even know about the life insurance or Colby's online relationship.
Wait, seriously? He made that ruling without all
A
the...
major oversight. And because of it, he actually changed Kristen's death certificate to homicide.
That's huge. You don't see that very often. Kristen's family must felt some vindication, right? After all those years of waiting.
Absolutely. They'd been suspicious of Colby from the get-go. They had to deal with years of suspicion, grief, not knowing. So this verdict, it finally gave them some closure.
So justice was finally served.
In a way, yes. But there's one last detail. That life insurance payout. Remember what investigators found out about that?
Oh, man, yeah. That Colby had bought a life-size sex doll with some of the money. Ugh, that just creeps me out. It always felt significant, but I couldn't put my finger on why.
It's chilling, no doubt. And it backs up the prosecution's whole argument about Colby's motives. He profited from his wife's death and showed absolutely zero remorse.
It's like a horror movie or something.
Yeah, it's truly disturbing. And it just makes you think. Things are not always what they seem, especially when it comes to relationships.
So true.
We've seen how even small inconsistencies can add up to a whole lot of evidence, and how our digital footprints, well, they can tell a story we might not want them to.
Makes you think twice about what you're posting online, that's for sure.
Absolutely. But it also raises some important questions. Could Kristen's death have been prevented? Are psychological autopsies really reliable? And how can we be more aware of those warning signs, the signs of domestic abuse?
Big questions that we need to think about. Even after the trial's over, it shows that even the most thorough investigation can leave us with unanswered questions. And finding justice, well, it can be a long and complicated journey.
You got that right. You know, one thing that keeps coming back to me with this case,
What's that?
it's the control thing.
Yeah, I see it too.
Colby, like every move he makes, the inconsistencies in his story, even that weird thing with the sex doll,
Right.
all of it screams like he needed to be in control.
Yeah, like he couldn't stand anything or anyone being outside of his control.
And remember those texts, the ones where Kristen was talking about getting her own bank account, being more independent?
Uh-huh.
It's kind of eerie to think that those messages might have set him off.
Totally makes you wonder, right? Like, did he see her independence as a threat? Like, she was getting away from his influence.
And that takes us back to that psychological autopsy.
Right.
Remember what Dr. Christensen concluded?
She said Kristen wasn't suicidal.
Exactly. And that goes against everything Colby was saying.
It's like that whole narrative Corby's trying to spin. The prosecution totally dismantled it.
And don't forget, that psychological autopsy, that was a risky move for the prosecution.
Yeah, it's not something you see every day in court.
They knew they needed something strong to counter that first suicide ruling.
And it seems like it worked.
Yeah, the jury was definitely moved by Dr. Christensen's testimony.
Makes you think about all the evidence we leave online, right? All those social media posts, those texts, even Google searches.
Oh yeah, it's a goldmine of information.
All that stuff can really paint a picture of someone's state of mind.
It's kind of crazy, right? On the one hand, we have all this data that can tell us so much about a person.
But on the other hand,
It makes you think about privacy and the possibility of all that information being misinterpreted.
it's true. Just because someone posts something online doesn't mean that's exactly how they feel.
It's all about context, right?
You need experts to look at that stuff, people like Dr. Christensen, who can make sense of it all.
People who know how to look at the evidence objectively.
And don't forget the human element, right? Kristen's family,
Right.
they had to wait years to get justice.
They were so strong, though.
They never gave up hope.
Never stopped believing that it wasn't a suicide.
It's really inspiring.
Their testimony about Colby's controlling behavior was powerful, too.
The way he isolated Kristen,
Tried to manipulate everyone.
it's heartbreaking.
It makes you wonder if there was anything that could have been done.
This case is a perfect example of how domestic abuse can be so insidious.
It often starts small, these little attempts to control.
Yeah, and then it escalates.
Sometimes it's too late before the victim even realizes the danger.
It seems like with Kristen, all those efforts she made to become independent,
It probably just made things worse.
yeah, just fueled his rage and his need to control her.
Which is why we all need to be aware of those red flags, those signs of abuse.
It's not always physical violence, is it?
No, it can be emotional, financial,
It can be isolating the victim from their friends and family.
breaking down their self-esteem.
We can't stay silent if we see those patterns.
Exactly.
We need to speak up, offer support,
Connect victims with the resources they need.
let them know they're not alone.
It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Creating a culture where we don't tolerate abuse.
Empowering victims to come forward.
That's a powerful message.
This deep dive goes beyond just solving a crime.
Yeah, it's about understanding how abuse works,
How to recognize the signs.
how to take action.
How to protect the vulnerable.
And it's about the impact technology has on our lives.
We've seen how digital evidence can uncover the truth.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
So we've talked about the evidence, the psychology, even how all this plays out in the digital age.
Right.
But there's one thing I keep coming back to.
I think I know what you're going to say.
That sex doll.
Yeah.
I just can't shake that image, you know? It's like,
It's pretty unsettling.
it's symbolic somehow, right?
It's a haunting detail, for sure.
It's like he couldn't let go of control even after taking his wife's life.
Almost like a twisted replacement.
Exactly.
It's a reminder of just how dark things can get.
Yeah, it's chilling.
We might never know what was going on in Colby's head.
But that one detail.
It's a stark reminder of what happens when possessiveness goes unchecked.
And it highlights just how urgent it is to address the root causes of domestic violence. You know, this case really shows how much evidence is changing in criminal investigation.
Oh, yeah. It's a whole new ballgame compared to even a few years ago.
We're talking digital footprints, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about how much of this case relied on digital evidence.
I mean, those cell phone records,
The Google searches Colby made,
social media posts.
even that purchase of the sex doll.
Wild, right?
It all told a different story than the one Colby's trying to tell.
It makes you think, what kind of trail am I leaving behind online?
It's a good question to ask yourself, right?
As if my online activity was ever looked at in court.
It can be kind of unnerving when you think about it.
Totally.
But it shows just how important it is to be aware of our digital footprint.
Right, because we're creating data all the time,
And we got to be mindful of how that data could be interpreted.
especially in a legal setting.
Exactly.
It's like we have a whole new level of responsibility.
I think you're right.
It's not just about us either.
No, it's about understanding how our actions online can affect others.
We need to have a bigger conversation as a society about all this, don't we?
I think so. Like, how do we handle this digital world that's constantly evolving?
Yeah, we need laws that make sense.
Regulations that can keep up with technology
But at the same time, we need to protect people's privacy.
and make sure justice is served.
It seems like privacy and justice are always kind of at odds with each other these days.
They are, especially when you're talking about technology.
It's not just about laws, though, is it?
No way. We got to educate ourselves, too.
Yeah, like understanding digital literacy,
Critical thinking.
being able to evaluate all the information that's out there.
Because misinformation spreads so quickly online.
It's true. We can't just be passive
I
anymore.
got to question things,
We
right?
will check sources.
Have those tough conversations about how tech is changing everything.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive.
We want to give people the tools they need to navigate this crazy world.
We're not just laying out the facts of a case,
We want you to see the bigger picture, understand what's really going on,
the challenges we're facing,
and how we can build a better world.
hopefully by going deep on these cases.
It'll get you thinking, asking those tough questions.
Make you want to be a part of the solution.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Kristen Trickle case,
Think about everything we've talked about.
think about technology in your own life,
What can you do to make sure justice wins?
How can we prevent tragedies like this from happening?
It's up to all of us to create a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll be back next week with a brand new case.
Another chance to explore the world together.
So until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.